Hi, I'm Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs of Atid and WebYeshiva, and we are beginning the study of Part 2 of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik's epic essay, Halachic Man. Over the course of 19 sessions in the previous series, we studied Part 1. The essay itself, the book, we should say, is divided into two uneven parts. There are 137 pages overall, about almost 100 of them, 98 of them in Part 1 are a descriptive analysis of this character, Halachic Man, and his two comrades, the cognitive man, who we sometimes identify as a cognitive scientist, and Homo religiosus, or religious man. In Hebrew, they're known as the Ish HaDa'at and the Ish HaDat, a clever pun on words, if you play on words, if you catch the meaning. For those of you that are new to our series, and welcome to you, there's nothing that we're going to be starting now that you shouldn't be able to follow along on, even if you haven't been part of the previous series, because section 2 of the work, part 2 of the work, really is something of a standalone essay, although you do need to know something about this character. Knowing something about the character of Halachic Man will definitely enhance your understanding of what's going on. But you're welcome to go into the archives and to review those 19 sessions about Halachic Man. But now we really are turning our attention exclusively to Halachic Man, as opposed to this kind of, sometimes ongoing back and forth analysis of comparing these three figures, Halachic Man, cognitive man, Homo religiosus, how in some ways he's more like this one, how in some ways he's more like that one, what are the differences between him and this one, and what are the differences between him and that one, and then of course comparing those two characters. And you'll remember that image that I used and put on the board countless times with the pyramid, the way that Halachic Man kind of stands above and apart from the other two. And then of course you'll also remember that chart that we used endlessly of the distinction in the attitudes of the three typological characters to reality and to their relationship to the supernal realm, to metaphysical questions, or their ignorance of, or their apathy to those questions in the case of cognitive man. That's all by way of review. Now, having gotten to know the character of Halachic Man by way of comparison, we turn our attention, or Rabbi Soloveitchik, I should say, turns his attention to understanding the central characteristic, the defining characteristic of Halachic Man, and that is his creative capacity. And part 2 of the essay, which is again the significantly shorter of the two, and I'm hopeful this will take us far fewer than 19 sessions to complete, relates to Halachic Man's creative capacity. Before we get into that, let me just say thank you to our friends Michael and Tiffany Beda, who again are sponsoring the series in memory of the late and lamented Rabbi Ezra Labaton, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha, who was taken from us too soon. I remind you of that website that was set up, WebYeshiva.org /Rabbi Labaton, from which you can access some other websites that contain Rabbi Labaton's Divrei Torah and speeches and drashot. And of course, it's appropriate that our learning of Rabbi Soloveitchik's monumental essay is dedicated to his memory, as he was a keen student of Rabbi Soloveitchik's teaching. And just finally, before we get going, I'll post into the chat box. You have it here also on the board. My email address. Those of you that are registered for the course, get periodic emails and reminders from me. Those of you that may be doing the course through the archives at whatever point in the future are, of course, welcome to be in touch with me with your thoughts and questions and comments as we move along. In the email that was sent out, and also, of course, in the archives on the website, you have access to a PDF that we'll just be using throughout the course of however many weeks it'll take us to finish this section, the part 2. So you can just keep referring back to that that PDF. But of course, it is strongly recommended that you get a copy of Halachic Man, which is available in all the different ways you might buy a Jewish book. Creativity. We should say a word about that. We should define what we mean by creativity, at least in this context. I remind you that since it is, after all, Elul, and we're gearing up for Rosh Hashanah, I remind you of something that we've learned in the past. Tshuva, repentance, was such a central theme to Rabbi Soloveitchik. And Tshuva, is sometimes, well, it's literally defined as return. It's more accurately defined as repentance. If you study Rabbi Soloveitchik's work, his Al HaTshuva, his collection of essays on the topic of Tshuva, which is translated as On Repentance, you'll discover that for Rabbi Soloveitchik, Tshuva is not properly defined as repentance, even though that's the title of the work, and it's not even properly defined as return, even though that's the title of the work and the literal meaning. But it's more properly defined as recreation. That tshuva is man's ability or woman's ability to recreate him or herself, to redefine vis-a-vis God and vis-a-vis fellow man, to redefine and to recreate your personality and who you are and what your standing in the spiritual world is. Because tshuva is an act of creativity. It's an act of creating yourself, from scratch. And anybody that's learned Rabbi Soloveitchik's teachings on tshuva will be familiar with that degree to which creativity, self-creativity, is so central. In an important essay, which I also uploaded, an essay by the late Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, who was also a close student of Rabbi Soloveitchik's. Rabbi Wurzburger has an essay that appeared in Tradition in 1996 called The Centrality of Creativity in the Thought of Rabbi Josephine Soloveitchik, which is an important background for this, although it deals with creativity not just in Halachic Man, but throughout the Rebbe's teachings. But it's important to remember that that the emphasis on creativity means different things at different points in Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings. In this essay, in Halachic Man, it's a very specific emphasis on creativity in the spiritual realm, principally through the act of Talmud Torah, a kind of intellectual, spiritual creativity. In other places, there's a discussion of creativity in the other realms, in the cultural realm, in the scientific realm. If you remember from our study of the Lonely Man of Faith, the discussion of the kivshuha, the Adam the first's impulse and imperative to have dominion over the world and to explore and to seek out new life and new civilizations. There, in the context of the space race in the 60s, the Rav was very favorable, had this very favorable attitude towards space exploration, which not all rabbinic figures had. There was a certain kind of a conservative impulse to think Shemayim Lashem v'ha'aretz natan l'bnei Adam, the heavens belong to God, and we shouldn't go meddling, and we shouldn't go messing, and etc. Rabbi Soloveitchik was very, like so many people in the 1960s, was so enthused by it, and he thought this was part of man's scientific exploration, and that too is a form of creativity. That's not the kind of creativity we're talking about here in Halachic Man, although clearly there's some overlap. The kind of creativity he's talking about here is, as you can see a little more explicitly if you follow the footnotes to this part of the essay, and you can refer back to the discussion that we had earlier in the series about Kabbalah, about Jewish mysticism, and the degree to which the Rav uses Kabbalistic notions. Principally, we talked about the concept of tzimtzum, God's self-contraction that was necessary in order to create a vacuum in which creation could take place. The degree to which he's utilizing Kabbalistic ideas in and of themselves, and the degree to which he uses them metaphorically in order to express ideas. Here you can really see that kind of metaphorical use of Kabbalah at play, and it's a little more explicit if you're following along in the footnotes to the essay. But the Rav in this section really is following in the footsteps of Reb Chaim Volozhiner in the Nefesh HaChaim. We've spoken about him before. Trip to Wikipedia or some other internet website will give you some background to Reb Chaim of Volozhin, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, the student of the Vilna Gaon, the founder of the great Volozhin Yeshiva, and the author of an extraordinarily important work of Jewish thought, of modern Jewish thought, of early modern Jewish thought, the Nefesh HaChaim, which relies heavily on Kabbalistic ideas. The Nefesh HaChaim, in discussing what it means to be created, Nivra Batselem, that we're created Batselem Elokim, that we're created in God's divine image, the Nefesh HaChaim defines our being godly, our being in God's image, in that we are creative beings. God, after all, is introduced to us in the Torah. I mean, God chooses to introduce himself first and foremost as a creator, as the Oseh Maaseh Breshit. As Rashi was attuned to, and we'll return to this momentarily, as Rashi was attuned to, it wasn't a given that the Torah had to begin with the tale of creation. And Rashi puts forth the hypothesis, which he rejects, but which is at least a plausible hypothesis, that the Torah, insofar as it's a law book, a legal code, a book of mitzvot, could have begun with the halachic code, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, the first mitzvah that's given when we get out of Egypt. But in fact, the Torah begins with the tale of creation. God chooses to introduce himself to us as the creator. And the Nefesh HaChaim points out that the degree to which we are a reflection of God is that we too are creative beings. The Rav will discuss this momentarily. But the Rav here is really walking in the footsteps of the Nefesh HaChaim on this topic, and he's actually going deliberately against the opinion of the Rambam. Maimonides thought that the degree to which, or the way in which we are created in God's image is not that we're creative, but what is it that marks us as being created in the divine image? Does anyone know, or does anyone want to gather venture a guess? What is the Rambam's definition of Tzelem Elokim? Intellect, correct, Barbara. That we are rational beings. That is the mark of our being in God's holy image. The reason that Rabbi Soloveitchik differs from the Rambam's position, Rabbi Wurzberger in that essay addresses it, and those that are interested can look there, may have something to do with the neo-Kantian philosophy in which Rabbi Soloveitchik was grounded, the degree to which the Rambam was really working within an Aristotelian worldview of what knowledge is and how knowledge functions, which was thought of differently in the modern world after the work of Immanuel Kant, and that's what drew the Rav away from the Rambam towards the Nefesh HaChaim. Those of you that are interested in this topic can take a look at Rabbi Wurzberger's essay, where some of these things are outlined and where the footnotes will lead you in the right direction to other reading. But here, the creativity that we're talking about in Halachic Man, in his creative capacity, is this sense of the kind of spiritual, intellectual realm of creativity, and it's that creativity which marks us as being in God's image. Let's take a look here at Chapter 1. Again, I remind you, the essay in total, the book in total, is divided into these two parts, and each part is subdivided into these chapter headings. So this is Part 2, Chapter 1. We're on page 99 in the essay if you're following along in the book. Halachic man is a man, and just again, I'll add now the asterisk and whether it applies to the whole series. The gendered language is just, largely a product of the time in which the work was written. There's nothing about Halachic man which would limit it to men and not women, but we can't make that. It would be too clumsy to add that disclaimer each time, so let this stand for the rest. Halachic man is a man who longs to create, to bring into being something new, something original. The study of Torah, by definition, means gleaning new, creative insights from the Torah, chidushe Torah. The Holy One rejoices in the dialectics of Torah, which is a popular folk saying, the editor puts in. It means this was a quote that the Rav brought that doesn't seem to, he's not quoting the Gemara. And then he has this kind of al tikre, this kind of homiletical reading. This expression about the pilpul of the Torah, pilpul is a kind of dialectic, it's a type of study, much derided, kind of hair-splitting style of Torah study. So the Rav says, "Al tikre pilpul el chidush." We're less interested in the kind of hair-splitting of forcing elephants through the eyes of needles and the like. That's kind of derided as this kind of stereotype sometimes of what Torah study in general, or Gemara study in particular, in its most narrow fashion becomes. But what God really wants is chidush, is innovation, is innovative, creative interpretation. This notion of chidush, this phrase which he'll come again and again. Let me just make the page a drop bigger. Hold on a sec. There you go. Chidush, from the root chadash, new. So chidush is something innovative, some kind of new insight to Torah, the kind of eureka moment that you have when you're studying Torah, that you form a new insight. That that kind of very interesting thing that, the Torah has been being studied for a really long time. And a lot of very clever people have bent their mind trying to understand it, trying to understand the Chumash, trying to understand the Tanakh, trying to understand the Gemara, trying to understand the Mishnah, trying to understand the Gemara, the Halakha, what have you. And nevertheless, we can all come along and we can work at it and we can come up with a new idea or a new interpretation, and it has to have integrity and it has to withstand the scrutiny of everything that's been said and thought before us. But every one of us can draw some new kind of interpretation and insight to what we study, and that's really a quite remarkable thing. Often as not, you come up with chidush, and only to discover that you did not innovate anything because it's a rather well-worn idea, and plenty of other people have said it. But in some ways, that's still a chidush in the sense that you were able to, that old idea that everybody tries to reinvent the wheel. Everybody tries to invent the wheel. That idea that there's certain ideas that come up simultaneously in different places. It's probably no less of if two people invented the wheel on opposite sides of the world simultaneously, independent of each other, well, it's as great an innovation in each place. And then, of course, there are times where we're mechadesh something, we come up with some kind of new insight, only to discover that it's based on faulty reasoning or bad information or miscalculation or misjudgment, and in fact, it's no chiddush at all, it's just an error. But nevertheless, we're still able to be mechadesh, to come up with new insights to the Torah. It's a creative interpretation. This notion of chiddush is not limited solely to the theoretical realm, but extends as well to the practical domain, into the real world. And you'll remember all of the discussions that we had previously about the relationship between the real world and the ideal realm. The most fervent desire of halakhic man is to behold the replenishment of the deficiency of creation, when the real world will conform to the ideal world. And again, you can go back and recall all of our discussions of the comparison of halakha to a kind of blueprint and how that aligns with the actual building that gets built. The ideal halakha, the exalted and glorious, the most exalted and glorious creation, the ideal halakha, will be actualized in its midst, in the midst of the real world. The dream of creation is the central idea in the halakhic consciousness. The idea of the importance of man as a partner of the Almighty in the act of creation. Man as the creator of worlds. That when we act creatively, when we fulfill our potential as being created in God's image through the kind of act of intellectual creation, we're actualizing in this world the ideal halakha, and that we're bringing, and again, I remind you, halakha in the sense of a kind of synonym for what others might call Judaism, what others might call the Torah. Not halakha narrowly defined as like, the set of laws about, blowing shofar. Kitzur hilchot shofar. That's halakha. But halakha with a capital H. Halakha is a kind of reflection of a system of thought. This longing for creation, the renewal of the cosmos, is embodied in all of Judaism's goals. And if at times we raise the question of the ultimate aim of Judaism, it also has it is also part of the eschatological vision, eschatological Yemot HaMashiach, that this is part of the path towards redemption. The halakha sees the entire Torah as consisting of basic laws and halakhic principles. Even the scriptural narratives serve the purpose of determining everlasting law. The mere face of the mere, I skipped a page here. Then the Rebbe goes on to this lengthy side point, which is something of a discussion of what we sometimes call halakha and agada, or that's principally in the Talmudic sense, but what we might think of as the difference or even the tension between narrative and law. Now, we very often think that there are these two different realms. There's the halachic legal, halacha in the narrow sense of the legal sections of the code, and then there's the agada or the narrative, the agada, the midrash in Chazal, or the narrative sections of Tanakh, of Chumash, that tell the stories. And as you know, Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, has precious few mitzvot, perhaps only 3 mitzvot. So if the Torah is a book of law, it could have saved itself a lot of space. But all those stories about Gan Eden and Noah and Avot and Avram, Yitzchak and Yaakov and Jacob, Joseph and his brothers and going to Mitzrayim, and etc. Again, the very same question that Rashi raises: what is the purpose of all of that? So the Rav, building upon ideas that we talked about in the past, is pushing forward this idea that everything is halacha. Not halacha in the sense of a specific law. There's a halacha that if you forget Yalav V'Yavo at night on Rosh Chodesh, you do not need to repeat the prayer. There's a halacha of what the Bet Din should do if Reuven steals money from Shimon. But halacha in the larger sense of the code of Jewish thought, which itself has a kind of normative import. Not normative in the sense of knowing, okay, well, how do I shake this lulav? Or how do I put on these tefillin? Or can I or can't I do the following thing on Shabbat? Or is this or that or the other thing muktzah? I have a book here. I mean, I guess it's good that it's printed as a book, because it would just be easier to make it as a website. But websites are a little hard to access on Shabbat when you need to know. And it's a book that, it's a hardcover book. It's there on my shelf with the books that deal with Hilchot Shabbat in that section of the library. But it's basically like a telephone book of muktzah. It's a list of 1,000, 2,000 different household items and objects, alphabetical, with a list of whether or not it's muktzah, whether or not it's forbidden to handle it on Shabbat, and if so, for what reason. It's like those books that list all the foods alphabetically and tell you what bracha to recite on it. If it's an apple, it's Brei Priya Eitz, and if it's a potato, it's Brei Priya Adama. But what about kasha knishes? What do you do with that? So you need to look it up in this little book. And there are people who maybe are new to brachot that carry those kinds of books around. It used to be this little pamphlet. Now I presume there's an app for your iPhone, which is similarly hard to access on Shabbat. So that's halacha with a lowercase h. I'm not diminishing its importance, but it's normative, meaning you need to know what to do. Is it Brei Priya Eitz or is it Brei Priya Adama? Is it or ain't it muktzah? Normative, that's what normative means. It means there's a law and it has to be followed, and it sets the norm for what the proper behavior is. So the Rav is making this argument that everything is normative. All of Sefer Bereshit, all of the stories of the Avot, all of the Agadot are normative in the sense that they lay down an instructive path for how one should lead his life. And in that way, all Agadah is also halacha. All narrative is also law. Therefore, he says, if the Torah spoke at length about the creation of the world, if the Torah has all of those prakim that talk about the creation of the world, it tells the story twice, a fact which Rabbi Soloveitchik took great interest in, and and wrote a whole book about Lonely Man of Faith. So if the Torah spoke at length about the creation of the world and related to us the story of the making of the heaven and the earth and all their hosts, it did so not in order to reveal cosmogonic secrets. Cosmogony is things related to the origin of the universe or the origin of the cosmos. So the Torah doesn't record Maaseh Breshit in order to tell us things about stellar physics or metaphysical mysteries. Because after all, the Torah is not a science book. People that get caught up with the problem, with the conflicts between science and religion, which is not something that Rabbi Soloveitchik was disturbed by. That was part of his great legacy to us, that we need not be afraid of science. We need not be afraid of the things that one studies in the university. The Torah can stand on its own 2 feet. That there isn't this kind of contradiction that people assume. Maaseh Breshit is not recorded in order to teach us metaphysical mysteries, but rather in order to teach us practical halakha. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of Genesis are no less practical halakha than Parshat Mishpatim, which deals with which is the home address for all of Din and Nezikin, all of financial law. The scriptural portion of creation narrative is a legal portion. Meaning it's also a legal portion in which are to be found basic, everlasting halachic principles, just like Parshat Kedoshim, just like Parshat Mishpatim, which are considered more properly legal codes. So how is story of Maaseh Breshit, the story of creation, a halachic text in the same way that Parshat Mishpatim is? Well, it all depends upon how you define halakha. If you define halakha in the expansive sense, so then it certainly is. Because if you study the first 2 chapters of Bereshit the way Rabbi Soloveitchik did, and the way he explains it in The Lonely Man of Faith, so you understand that it's text that gives us a kind of insight to the purpose of man in the world. And since it instructs us on how we are meant to be, it instructs us it helps us understand something about ourselves and our role in the world and our task as created, commanded beings. So then it's also a halachic text, even though it's not a halachic text like the chapter that lists which animals are kosher and which animals are not kosher. If the Torah then chose to relate to man the tale of creation, we may clearly derive one law from this manner of procedure. That is, that man is obliged to engage in creation and the renewal of the cosmos. So what is the halakha? What is the halakha of Genesis chapter 1? The halakha is, if you want to kind of convert it into like the language of the Shulchan Aruch, the halakha is mahu afata. Just as God is a creator, so too we must be creators. If we are commanded to walk in His way, if we are commanded to imitate God, lidamot b'drachav, so what is on God's calling card? Well, He's a lot of different things. He's the giver of the Torah, and He's the one who took us out of Egypt. He's the one who split the sea. He's the one that brought us into Eretz Yisrael. But the calling card, the sign on His front door, as it were, is Creator of the world, right? CEO, the Creative Executive Officer, right? He is the Creator. That's his first entree into our consciousness. And that's why, although again, as Rashi suggests, didn't have to be that way. We can imagine a parallel universe in which the Torah is written differently. But even Rashi there, for different purposes, in the first Rashi in Chumash, Rashi says, why does the Torah have to start with the story of creation? It could have started with HaKodesh Zevachem. So it's there to instruct us on the narrative. The narrative portions also instruct us in the normative sense. Not for naught is Judaism acquainted with the book of creation. So here he's talking. He's making a kind of play. The Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, is a significant Kabbalistic text. It's a very early and significant Kabbalistic text. But here he's not referring to that Kabbalistic text, the Sefer Yetzirah. He's talking to the Sefer, quote unquote, Yetzirah, the book about creation, which is Sefer Bereshit. The master which enables one both to create and destroy worlds. Rabbah said, here's a quote from the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Rabbah said, if the righteous desired it, they could be creators of worlds. As it is written, but your iniquities are separated between you and your God. Okay, if it weren't for the fact that we inevitably sin, and sin is something that distances us from God, but if it weren't for that, we too could be creators of worlds. And then Rashi explains that pasuk in Sefer Yeshayahu, that we may infer from this that if mankind would not have any iniquities, there would be no distinction between man and God in the matter of creation. Rabbah created a man, Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Oshia, spent every Shvat even studying the book of creation, that's the actual Sefer Yetzirah, perhaps, and created a third grade, etc. That, these kinds of wonder tales of the golem and the idea that in theory, in potential, we could also be creators. I mean, creators not just in the intellectual sense or in the cultural sense or in the scientific sense, but actual creation. But because of our shortcomings limit the degree. It impinges on our actualizing our ability to fully engage the degree to which we are B'Tselem Elokim in God's image, and therefore our ability to create and to act creatively has been eclipsed. And this is a Kabbalistic idea that the Rav introduces here. The idea that at least in potential we have even greater creative capacity, which has been sidetracked. The peak of religious ethical perfection to which Judaism aspires is man as creator. And then he mentions this idea, fairly well an idea, that even God, when God creates the world, he creates it in an imperfect manner. This is an idea that people that are familiar with the teachings of the Maharal of Prague may have encountered. It's an idea that he gave great emphasis to, that in creation itself, that creation itself leaves over space for man to act as partner to God. This is a very famous comment of the Maharal about Brit Milah. The Gemara already mentions this idea, but the Maharal seems to have taken to it the idea that Brit Milah, that even in the creation of man, there's work left over for us to partner with God in perfecting the creation. Man's task is to fashion, engrave, attach, and create, and transform the emptiness in being into a perfect and holy existence bearing the imprint of the divine name. Then he quotes the psukim from Bereshit, the first chapter of Genesis. The earth was tohu vavohu, chaos and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep. God said, "Let there be light." It's a recounting of the act of creation, but creation, yesh miyayin, everything from scratch, and that before creation, the outset of creation, there was tohu vavohu. It was chaos. When God engraved and carved out the world, he did not entirely eradicate the chaos and void. That built into creation, there remains this force of chaos, of destruction. and we're trying to fight back that impulse, trying to hold back that tide of destruction through our creative acts. God separated the complete perfect existence from the forces of negation, confusion, and turmoil, and set up cosmic boundaries, eternal laws to keep them apart. Now, Judaism affirms the principle of creation out of absolute nothingness, yesh miyayin. Therefore, the chaos and the void, the deep, the darkness, and the relative nothingness must all have been fashioned by the Almighty before the creation of the orderly, majestic, beautiful world. The chaos itself is part of creation. The void is part of creation. And these two opposite forces are at work, are built into creation. That there's no neutral. There's no coasting on neutral. That if you're not constantly building up, then it's all somehow going to get torn down. I'll skip ahead towards the bottom of this page. The forces of relative nothingness at times exceed their bounds. He develops this kind of metaphor of yin and yang, of chaos and creation working against each other, and that the boundary, the border between the two is one of halakha, is one of law, is one of normative ritual, and the kind of boundaries of law, which, we in general, there is this notion of law as a kind of civilizing element. That without law, so we would, Adam la Adam ze'ev, that it would be dog eat dog, and it's the laws that civilize us. It's that sense of the social contract. It's the Hobbesian view of the world, that without law, we would all just, revert to our worst impulses, and living under a system of law is the price we're willing to pay so that we can sleep at night. I give up maybe my ability to go out and pillage the world for my own profit so that I can sleep at night knowing that hopefully you won't be doing the same. So here, it's a different notion. Here, the law we're talking about is not merely a kind of civil code, but it's the bounding in of creation within a system of halakha that keeps out the forces of destruction. Because within the boundaries of halakha is a world of creation. It's kind of like imagine imagine a balloon that's filled with air inside a vacuum. And the air that fills the balloon against the walls of the vacuum is all that's keeping the forces of nothingness at bay. The membrane of the balloon is this thin division that contains the yesh, that contains that which is. I mean, we don't tend to think of air in that way, right? Because air is invisible. We're not conscious of it in the same way we are of other things, even of light. Light is similarly ephemeral, even though it exists. It has physical properties, but it's not like sand. It's not like rock. But air is the same way, right? And there's air in this room. It surrounds us. In a vacuum, the air would dissipate. But if you fill a balloon with air inside a vacuum, so you've contained something which is inside something which is not. And the membrane of the balloon is what would hold it together. But it's the air inside the balloon that's pushing out the walls of the membrane, the walls of the balloon, and that forms that boundary. It defines the scope and the shape and the parameters of that boundary between yesh and between ayin, between that which is and that which is void. That's the halakha. The halakha, again, broadly defined, is that border between the forces of vacuum, the forces of chaos, the forces of nothingness, the forces of destruction, and the creativity of that which is that occupies the inside of the borderland. The relative nothingness at times exceed their bounds. They wish to burst forth out of the chains of obedience that the Almighty imposed upon them, to seek and plunge the earth back into chaos and void. It is only the law that holds them back and bars the path before them. And he's got this description of chok, what chok is, that chok meaning law, but chok comes from the same shorish as lachkok, to carve, to engrave. That like the letters that are carved on the tablet, it's not like letters written with ink. You take a blank piece of paper, you superimpose ink on top of the paper or the parchment, and that's what the writing is. So something which is chakuk, you write through removing, you write through carving out, through engraving. So the law, chok, is this boundary. The perfect and complete ontic being extends into the divinely carved out boundary. Beyond that border is the deep chaos and the void, darkness, nothingness, devoid of image and form. However, the relative nothingness is plotting evil. It's never at rest. The vacuum always wants to fill all the space. The deep is devising iniquity. And the chaos and the void lie in wait in the dark alleyways of reality and seek to undermine the absolute being, to profane the lustrous image of creation. Then he quotes these psukim from Borchi Nafshi, from Tehillim chapter 104. Gvul samta, you set a bound which they should not pass over. This idea of the halakha is the boundary that keeps the forces of chaos, the forces of destruction outside, and creativity inside. And then he develops this idea of nature. In other words, it's a metaphorical idea, or maybe it's even a double metaphor, because it's a metaphor used to explain the idea which is itself metaphorical, this idea of chaos and void. But the idea of like the waves crashing on the sea, kind of the forces of nature, as which there is this destructive force in nature that's always at work, and only through vigilance and through building does it build up. There's this extended discussion here. You can read it to yourself. This quote from the Gemara in Sukkah, and there's also a Gemara in Yerushalmi in the Sanhedrin about creation. That when David HaMelech wanted to start the construction, or at least to lay the foundations for what would become the Beit HaMikdash, they started digging the foundation. And everybody knows if you dig down deep enough, you hit groundwater. So David HaMelech dug the pits. The deep arose and threatened to submerge the world. He kind of like the equivalent, the Torah equivalent of like hitting the water main, which is very destructive. They're digging to I don't know, make a new road or something, and by accident they hit the water main, and there's this huge flood, and nobody has water in the town, and all the water pressure goes down. So they're digging, and they hit the deep, meaning this idea of the tahom, the water, the waters of creation. You remember in the Noah story in the Mabul story, in the flood. It's not just that there's plentiful rain from above, but the Mayanot Tahom, the subterranean oceans, break forth and flood the world from below. So David HaMelech, he kind of hits this kind of this water main underneath, and he, in order to hold back these waters of the deep, he writes God's holy name on a potsherd, and he throws it down into the deep, and it kind of acts like a plug, like a mystical plug that reseals up the deep. So there's this other story that when he's digging the foundations of the temple, he dug 15 cubits and he didn't reach the deep. He didn't reach the water. And finally, he found one potsherd and sought to lift it up. But the potsherd, the kind of the plug of the deep, says to him, "Don't do it." Said David to the potsherd, "And why not?" So the potsherd says to David, "Because it is I who am restraining the deep." David said to the potsherd, "And for how long have you been here?" The potsherd says to him, "Since the Almighty proclaimed on Mount Sinai, Anochi Hashem Elokecha," from the moment that the 10 Commandments were given. So isn't that interesting? What would you have assumed? What would you assume? Like, how long had that potsherd been there, holding back the deep, being the plug, keeping the underwaters at bay? What would you have thought? So you might have thought that it was there since creation, or you might have thought it was there since Noah, but it's not. It's there from the moment of Har Sinai. So isn't that interesting? Just as a matter of Haggadah. So it fits in very nicely here. That the chaos is held at bay from the moment of revelation, from the moment of God as lawgiver. We met God as creator, but then God takes on a different role. You know, some people who have different jobs, they have those business cards. You know, they say different things on either side of the card. So God's business card, it says God, creator of the world. But on the other side, it says God, giver of the Torah, lawgiver. Because God as giver of the Torah, God as the lawgiver, God as the one who sets down the norms that create space for creativity, that enables space for creativity. God is the giver of Torah. And it's the creativity that serves as the oxygen that holds the vacuum back. Right? The Torah becomes the membrane, or becomes the balloon that gives shape for creation to exist in a world of vacuum. It's what holds back the flood and the force of destruction, the force of nothingness. It's held firm in the grip of the mighty law and its principles. It's Anochi, I am the Lord your God. That very first commandment, that very first of the Aseret HaDibrot, which is the moment at which the chaos gets plugged up. He mentions now this idea as it plays out in the Kabbalistic literature, the forces of evil, the forces of destruction, the forces of chaos, the Sitra Achra, the Klipot, the Tohoma Rabbah, the Malachei Chabala, all these different synonyms and Kabbalistic notions, which all symbolize the realm of emptiness and the void, the domain of nothingness, devoid of any image or stature. That does battle with the glorious existence enveloped by the lust in the image of divine presence. However, this view, which threads its way through the entire course of Jewish thought, is not just a mysterious theoretical notion, but a practical principle, a fundamental ethico-halachic postulate. Right? That creativity creation is the thing that holds back destruction. But the two are ever in this ongoing struggle. This all by way of introduction to one view of the Jewish view on creativity, because he's influenced here by the Nefesh HaChaim, although interestingly, not explicitly. Since he is here, we have the importation of the Kabbalistic notions and of the Kabbalistic metaphors. And again, the degree to which they are metaphors and less essential to the discussion, we could strip the discussion of all of the Kabbalistic language, and it would still stand on its own. But that comes from the Nefesh HaChaim, and then from here we will go on. We'll try to cover at least one chapter in each session, try to read ahead, and of course I welcome your comments and thoughts and ideas and questions as we move along. We'll continue next week.